When this man demanded to dig up his mother's coffin, the priest at first didn't let him, but he insists, and what he discovered changed everything in his life. The moon hung heavy in the sky, casting a pale glow over the cemetery as Daniel stood in front of his mother's grave. It had been months since her funeral, yet the sorrow that consumed him had not eased. The flowers he had left were already wilting, mirroring the decay he felt inside. He hadn't slept for weeks, plagued by nightmares so vivid that they seeped into his waking moments. Each dream was the same. He would find himself in the cemetery, his feet heavy as if the earth itself were trying to pull him down. He would walk toward his mother's grave, and in the stillness of the night, her voice would whisper, "Help me." In his dreams, he would dig. The soil was wet and cold, clinging to his fingers, but he couldn't stop. When he finally reached the coffin and pried it open, what lay inside was not his mother, but an empty abyss. It was as though she had vanished, her body stolen from its resting place, leaving nothing but darkness in its wake. The memory of the dream still haunted him, making it difficult to function. His wife, Clara, had been patient with him, but even her concern was starting to wear thin. Daniel knew he needed help, but no counselor or medication could erase the images that flooded his mind. One evening, unable to bear it any longer, he visited Father Michael, the family priest who had known his mother well. The old priest had always been a comforting presence in his life, but as Daniel stood before him, the weight of his desperation was too much to bear. Father Daniel's voice cracked. "I need to see her again. I need to know if she's really there." Father Michael furrowed his brow, a hint of concern crossing his face. "Daniel, you were at the funeral. You saw her laid to rest. What you're experiencing? It's grief, my son. Grief does strange things to the mind. But what if she's not there?" Daniel's eyes were bloodshot from sleeplessness. "What if something happened? What if she's calling for me?" The priest sighed, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "These dreams, they're not real. They're manifestations of your sorrow. You must let her rest." But Daniel couldn't let go. He left the church that night with a resolve that terrified him. He would open his mother's grave no matter the cost. Daniel's nightmares grew worse. Each night the dream became more vivid, more insistent. The whisper of his mother's voice was no longer a distant call, it was a scream, echoing in his mind even after he woke. He could feel her terror, as though it were his own, and he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. Clara tried to help. She had suggested counseling, and he had gone, but it hadn't worked. The counselor had talked about the stages of grief, about how time would heal the wounds, but time wasn't helping. In fact, every passing day only deepened the ache inside him. "I'm worried about you," Clara said one evening, her voice soft but firm. "You're not yourself, Daniel. You're not sleeping, you're not eating. Maybe it's time to talk to someone again." "I don't need a counselor," Daniel muttered, rubbing his temples. "I need answers." Clara hesitated. What answers? He didn't respond. He couldn't tell her what he was really thinking, what he was planning. She would never understand. No one would. But Daniel had made up his mind. He would return to the cemetery, alone, and dig up his mother's coffin. Only then would he find peace. In the dark of night, Daniel began his preparations. He rented a shovel, gloves, and a lifting machine, hiding them in the shed behind their house where Clara wouldn't see. The guilt gnawed at him, but he couldn't let it stop him. His mother was calling to him, and he had to answer. He chose Sunday, knowing that Father Michael would be preoccupied with Mass. No one would be at the cemetery that early in the morning, and he could work in peace. He rehearsed the plan in his mind over and over again: drive to the cemetery, dig up the grave, and see for himself what was inside. The night before, Daniel barely slept. His dreams had shifted now. He didn't just hear his mother's voice, but saw flashes of her face, twisted in anguish. The terror in her eyes was unbearable, and he woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding in his chest. He had to do it. There was no turning back. Sunday morning arrived, cold and quiet. Daniel kissed Clara on the forehead as she slept, careful not to wake her. He grabbed his keys and headed for the cemetery, the tools rattling in the back of his car. As he approached his mother's grave, the world seemed eerily still. The tombstones stood like silent sentinels, watching as he unloaded the shovel and lifting machine. His breath fogged in the cold air, and his heart raced with anticipation. He stood before the grave, staring at the headstone with his mother's name etched into the granite. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered, before plunging the shovel into the earth. The digging was harder than he had anticipated. The soil was heavy, and every shovelful felt like it was weighing down on his soul. His arms ached, but he couldn't stop. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, urging him on. As he dug deeper, the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the cemetery. Sweat dripped down his face despite the cold, and his heart pounded in his chest. He had nearly reached the coffin when he heard a voice behind him. Daniel. Nah? He froze, his blood running cold. Slowly, he turned to see Father Michael standing at the edge of the grave, his face pale with shock. What are you doing? The priest demanded, his voice filled with a mix of horror and disbelief. Daniel wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands trembling. I had to know. I had to see for myself. Father Michael's face softened, but there was an edge of fear in his eyes. This is madness, Daniel. You can't do this. You have to stop. I can't, Daniel whispered. I need to know if she's there. The priest shook his head. You were at the funeral. You saw her laid to rest. Then why does she keep calling me? Daniel's voice broke. Why do I keep seeing her, hearing her? I need to know. Father Michael was silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the half-dug grave. If you do this, he said quietly, there will be consequences. You may not like what you find. I don't care, Daniel replied. I have to do this. With a heavy sigh, the priest stepped back, watching as Daniel continued to dig. The sound of the shovel hitting the coffin was like a gunshot in the still morning air, and Daniel's heart leapt in his chest. He cleared away the remaining dirt and attached the lifting straps to the coffin. With a groan of effort, he raised it from the ground and set it gently beside the grave. His hands shook as he reached for the lid. Please, God, he whispered, let her be there. With trembling fingers, Daniel pried open the coffin lid. The hinges creaked in protest, and for a moment he was afraid to look. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow and ragged. But when he finally opened his eyes, what he saw made his blood run cold. The coffin was empty. His mother's body was gone. Daniel stumbled backward, his legs giving out beneath him as the world spun around him. His mind raced, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. How could this be possible? He had been at the funeral. He had seen her body. He had watched as the casket was lowered into the ground. Where is she? He gasped, his voice barely a whisper. Father Michael stepped forward, his face ashen. I don't know, he said, his voice shaking. I don't understand. Daniel's thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and terror. Had someone stolen her body? Was it a grave robbery? Or was there something darker at play? We have to call the police, the priest said, reaching for his phone. But Daniel barely heard him. His mind was consumed by the image of the empty coffin, the black void where his mother should have been. The dreams. They had been trying to tell him something. She wasn't resting in peace. She wasn't even in her grave. The police arrived within the hour, flashing lights cutting through the early morning fog. Officers swarmed the cemetery, cordoning off the area around the grave. Daniel sat on the edge of the grave, staring at the empty coffin, numb to the chaos around him. Two officers approached him, their faces a mixture of skepticism and concern. Mr. Adams, one of them said, kneeling beside him, can you explain what happened here? Daniel blinked, trying to find the words. I had to see. I had to know if she was there. And why would you think she wasn't? The officer asked, his tone carefully neutral. The dreams, Daniel muttered, running a hand through his disheveled hair. She kept calling to me. I thought maybe. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. You thought maybe she wasn't in the grave? Daniel nodded, his throat dry. And she wasn't. The officer sighed, standing up and motioning for the paramedics. We're going to take you to the hospital, Mr. Adams. You've been through a lot. No, Daniel said, his voice firmer than he felt. I'm not crazy. She's gone. Someone took her. The officers didn't argue, but their expressions made it clear that they didn't believe him. As the paramedics approached, Daniel felt a surge of frustration. No one believed him. No one understood. But as they loaded him into the ambulance, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a missing body. His mother had been trying to tell him something in those dreams, and now he was more determined than ever to find out what. Later that evening, after being discharged from the hospital, Daniel returned home, his mind racing. Clara was waiting for him, her face pale with worry. What happened? She asked, her voice trembling. Daniel shook his head, too exhausted to explain. I don't know. I don't know what's going on. Clara pulled him into a hug, but he barely felt her touch. His thoughts were consumed by the empty coffin, the mystery of his mother's disappearance. He had to figure it out. He had to know where she was. That night, as Clara slept beside him, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about the moment he had opened the coffin. In his haze of confusion and fear, he had almost forgotten the small envelope he had found inside, tucked into the corner of the coffin. Quietly, so as not to wake Clara, Daniel slipped out of bed and retrieved the envelope from his coat pocket. It was old and worn, the edges frayed with age. His name was written on the front in his mother's elegant handwriting. With trembling hands, Daniel opened the envelope and pulled out the letter inside. The paper was yellowed with time, but the ink was still clear. Daniel, If you're reading this, it means something has gone terribly wrong. I never wanted you to find out this way, but I had no choice. Daniel's heart pounded as he read on. There are things about our family that you don't know. Secrets that have been kept for generations. If you found this letter, it means those secrets have come to light. You must follow the coordinates on the back of this letter. There you will find the answers you seek. Daniel flipped the letter over, and sure enough, there were coordinates scrawled in the corner. He grabbed his phone, entering the numbers into a map app. The location was in a remote part of the state, hours away from where he lived. He stared at the screen, his mind racing. What was his mother hiding? What secrets had she taken to her grave? And more importantly, why had she left this letter for him to find? The next morning, Daniel packed a small bag and left a note for Clara, telling her he needed to clear his head for a few days. He didn't tell her where he was going or why. He wasn't sure she would believe him, and he didn't want to drag her into something that could be dangerous. As he drove, the landscape became more desolate, the roads narrower and more winding. The coordinates led him deep into the countryside, to an area he had never visited before. The sky was overcast, casting a gloomy pall over the barren fields that stretched out on either side of the road. After hours of driving, he reached the location marked by the coordinates. It was an old, abandoned house, its windows boarded up and the roof sagging with age. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, and the paint on the walls was peeling, exposing the weathered wood beneath. Daniel parked his car and got out, his heart pounding. This was it. Whatever secrets his mother had hidden, they were here. As he approached the house, a sense of unease settled over him. The air was heavy, and the silence was oppressive. It felt as though the house itself was watching him, waiting for him to uncover its secrets. He reached the front door and hesitated. For a moment he considered turning back, but the pull of the mystery was too strong. He couldn't stop now. Taking a deep breath, Daniel pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior of the house was just as dilapidated as the outside. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. Broken furniture littered the floor, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like curtains. But as Daniel ventured deeper into the house, he noticed something strange. There were symbols carved into the walls, ancient markings that he didn't recognize. They seemed to form a pattern, leading him down a narrow hallway toward a door at the end. His heart raced as he reached for the door handle, his hand shaking. He turned the knob and pushed the door open, revealing a dark staircase leading down into the basement. The air grew colder as Daniel descended the stairs, each step creaking beneath his weight. The darkness seemed to press in around him, suffocating in its intensity. His breath was shallow, his pulse thudding in his ears. At the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a large, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old books and dusty relics. But it was the object in the center of the room that caught his attention. A large stone pedestal stood in the middle of the floor, and on top of it sat a small wooden box, intricately carved with the same symbols he had seen on the walls upstairs. It seemed to pulse with a strange energy, drawing him closer. Daniel approached the box, his hands trembling as he reached for it. He could feel the weight of the moment, the gravity of whatever secret lay inside. He opened the box. Inside was another letter, written in the same handwriting as the first. But this one was longer, and as Daniel read it, his world was turned upside down. My dearest Daniel, I am so sorry you had to find out this way. There are things about our family that I never wanted you to know, things that I tried to protect you from. But if you're reading this, it means that I am gone, and the truth can no longer be hidden. Our family is part of something much larger than you can imagine. We are the keepers of an ancient secret, one that has been passed down through generations. It is a secret that has the power to change the world, but also one that comes with great danger. I tried to shield you from this life, but it seems that fate had other plans. The coordinates I left you have led you here for a reason. Inside this house is the key to unlocking the truth about our family and our legacy. But be warned, Daniel, there are those who would do anything to keep this secret buried. Trust no one, not even those closest to you. I love you, my son. Be safe. Daniel stared at the letter, his heart pounding. The weight of his mother's words pressed down on him, suffocating in their intensity. What had she gotten him into? As Daniel stood there, holding the letter, the door at the top of the stairs creaked open. He spun around, his heart racing as footsteps echoed down the stairs. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man dressed in black, his face obscured by a hood. He moved with purpose, his eyes locked on Daniel. Who are you? Daniel demanded, his voice shaking. The man didn't answer. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, intricately carved pendant, identical to the one Daniel's mother had always worn around her neck. I've been waiting for you, the man said, his voice low and cold. You found the first clue, but the real journey is just beginning. Daniel's mind raced. What are you talking about? Who are you? The man stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. Your mother was the last keeper of the secret. Now it's your turn. Before Daniel could respond, the man turned and disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Daniel standing alone in the cold, dark basement, his mind reeling with questions. What was this secret? What had his mother been hiding all these years? And what would he have to sacrifice to uncover the truth? The answers lay somewhere in the darkness, waiting for him to find them. But one thing was clear: his life would never be the same again.